Okay, welcome. Thanks so much for being here with us. My name is Jess Rhea. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a Brazilian person with light skin and red hair, wearing black glasses and a blue shirt today. I'm an assistant professor of data science and public policy, and I also co-lead the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab at UVA, who is like the sponsor and who is supporting this series since last year. And together with my colleague Yasmin Kurzi, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the DTD Lab and an assistant professor of law at FGV in Brazil, we are organizing the Gender in Tech online talk series with the goal of discussing how gender shapes and is shaped by technologies with perspectives from the global majority, mostly. And we want to bring together scholars, practitioners, and advocates to explore how the work we do can help advance democracy and human rights. And today we are hosting the 9th session of the talk series, focusing on immigration, techno, authoritarianism. And together with our colleagues Roya Paxad and Ana Nougrères, we will discuss the role of digital technologies in the production and expansion of surveillance networks that currently impact fundamental rights, enshrine authoritarian practice in public services and process, and deepen social inequalities all over the world. In the next and final, unfortunately, webinar, thanks for being there with us for like all these months. So the final one would be on possible AI futures, and it will be by the last week of April to confirm the dates. If you're subscribed to the newsletter, or like if you follow us, you probably see it, but it should be like the last week of April. And by the end of this year, we'll launch a report based on all the topics we cover in the series and also our current projects, and that will be available open access as well. And for today, we know English is not the first language of many of us, so please feel free to ask questions in Portuguese, Spanish, and French if that helps, and we'll do our best to translate them. And you can use the Q&A feature located in the bar at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions as well. And automated closed captions are available. We've turned that on. And the recording will also be available on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So thank you again for being here, for supporting this series. And next we'll hear from Yasmin Kurzi, who will moderate the conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jess. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Yasmin Kurzi. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a Latina woman with light skin, brown hair, brown eyes, and wearing a black sports coat and a beige dress. So as Jess said before, the series aims to center feminist, queer, and the global majority perspectives in the debate on technology, democracy, and human rights. Today's session will focus on how immigration systems are increasingly shaped by digital technologies and how these systems can reinforce techno-authoritarian practices. So we will explore how surveillance technologies are used in border control and migration management, how public-private partnerships also facilitate these systems, and what accountability mechanisms exist or fail to exist when rights are violated. So we are also interested in how these dynamics intersect with gender and vulnerability, of course, and what forms of resistance and support are emerging. So we are honored to welcome two outstanding speakers on this subject. First, we'll hear from Roya Paxad, who is the founder and director of Tara's Research and Builder in Residence at Mozilla. Mozilla AI, sorry. Her work explored human rights-centered technology, design, AI safety, and how incorporate accountability with particular attention to how technologies impact marginalized communities, including migrants. So let's start with Roya's remarks. Roya, thank you so much for joining us here for this series. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Sure, of course. Thank you so much, Yasmin, for the introduction and for the invitation. And thank you so much, Jess, and the School of Data Science and Karsh Institute. I'm so happy to be back at UVA. I had a fellowship 2 years ago, and some part of the work that I'm going to present is based on the information I got during my fellowship time. As Yasmin said, my name is Roya Paxad. I'm the founder of Taros. I'm based in Santa Cruz, California. I use the pronoun she, her. I have brown eyes, brown skin, brown hair. I'm from Iran originally, and I'm wearing a gray sweater. I'm going to share my screen with you all. So today, the title of my talk is the digitization of migration control. And just to give a brief outline, I will provide some types of the technologies that are used in migration control and border control. Then I will be talking a little bit about gender and sexuality dimension in migration control. The third issue that I wanted to bring it up, it's about the externalization of borders through technology and through privatizations. And I would like to also talk about why advocacy and accountability about migration technologies have been so difficult for human rights and migrants' rights workers. And I want to end with the ask that I have from you, especially from students and researchers in this group, about public scrutiny and procurement transparency in migration technologies, and provide some way to do some research about what's happening in contracts and procurement practices when it comes to migration technology. The first types of technology that I wanted to just share with you is the tech-enabled alternative to detention. Starting in 2004, the US government, and this is applicable to Europe, but the US government started thinking about alternative to detention as a more humane way of detaining asylum seekers and migrants coming to its border. It was supposed to be more humane. It was supposed to be more community-based. Caseworkers, they were supposed to be assigned to migrants and asylum seekers and help them to integrate with the local communities, with showing up in the court for their interviews and providing some legal supports and services. However, we have seen the new wave of using electronic alternative detention. The technology that are used in this types of EADT, in short, is kind of like GPS and location-based ankle bracelets, a mobile app, biometric voice verification, and data analytic platforms. And the company that is mainly behind these types of EAT is BI Incorporated, which is now owned by Geo Group. And Geo Group is one of the world's largest private prison companies in the world. And BI, if you go to their website, they say that we also partner with other technology companies, including Google, Sprint, and Verizon, for all types of GPS and mapping capabilities and also AI capabilities. EADT, they have raised human rights concerns, as I mentioned, about freedom of movement, but above that, about the dignity of asylum seekers and migrants, because in some cases, advocates describe it as electronic chains. Here is an example of ankle bracelet that I was talking about. And here is the code from Carla Garcia from Ofrane. It's a civil society organization working with Garifonas it's an Afro-Indigenous community in Central America. And it says, we, the Garifonas, were slaves and we freed ourselves. We are a community that fought against the colonizers. And then this type of program, and they're referring to electronic ankle monitors, make us remember our history. Just as before they placed the slaves in iron chains, now in the capitalist economy, our chains are electronics. The second type of technologies that it's used in migration control is automated language and dialect recognition. And this has been used at least it has been covered in German, a newspaper, or in Germany. The Federal Refugee Agency, they use AI-powered language detection software to verify asylum seekers' claim about their national ethnic background, and they use often these technologies to identify accents or dialects of origins. And the tool is provided by Nuance Communications, another private company that is now owned by Microsoft. And there have been many studies by journalists and also many commentaries by language experts, language technology experts, that the software struggles with less common dialect and atypical names, as they say. And in one document in 2018, when they tested these tools, they realized that for Egyptian Arabic, 72% of the time, the language is categorized as unknown. And in 8.4% of the time, it was even categorized as Vietnamese. And when we think about migration authorities or interviewers or asylum officers using these technologies, sometimes as objective tools, we can see that some of these errors, what type of issues it might create for asylum seekers, and it might even reject their cases. The other type of technologies that I wanted to mention was data extraction software. There have been many European countries, Denmark, Austria, Germany, and more, that they passed laws to make it possible for migration authorities to confiscate asylum seekers' phones and extract personal data to corroborate their claims, to see if the claims they're making about their asylum journey actually matches their digital footprint. Cellbrite is an Israeli digital forensic company. The main investor is Japan's Sun Corporation, and they are the leading provider of these types of data extraction software companies, services. The software, it claims that it can even access browsing history, social media data, GPS records, and even when you delete your information, still it can have this cloud-based data access. There was a case in Denmark that asylum seekers was describing their journey, and then based on the information that they received from data extraction software, they realized that the time that the asylum seeker is saying that he was in jail, there were some Facebook activities on their social media platform based on this software. And so they realized that the asylum seeker is lying, because how could you have Facebook activity when you are in jail? But then the asylum seeker was mentioning that my brother has a password of my account, so he used my platform. But they rejected the case because they thought that it's a lie. But if you have used some social media platforms, you know that, or you have been working with migrants or like with your family members, you know that it's not uncommon to share your password with your loved one for any cases, especially in these cases of migration and when the person is doing asylum journey. So this objective decision that was made by data extraction software and Cellbrite, it rejected the claim of this person. And there are more and more. And biometric registrations of migrants is another type of collection of fingerprints, iris scans, DNA. It's done in the United States, it's done in Europe, and there are vast data sharing between humanitarian organizations, including UNHCR and World Food Programs and government agencies. And in one of the cases, we know Rohingyas refugees. They were in Myanmar, they went to Bangladesh, the data was collected in Bangladesh government through UNHCR program, and then it was shared by Myanmar government, exactly the government who they fled from. So you can see how this data sharing between organizations and between government agencies, in fact, endanger asylum seekers and migrants, instead of necessarily giving them this legal status or registration status. There are other types of technologies, including data-driven refugee resettlement and integration in host cities based on employment likelihood, in a way that, for example, they receive the data mainly from head of the household information, who filled out the asylum application, the language they speak, the type of educations they had, religion, and based on that, they say, okay, if you go to Virginia, you will have a better integration likelihood and better likelihood for finding employment. But what we try to look, and this was a pilot program, I don't know if they are actually, I mean, it was between Switzerland and Stanford University. I don't know if they decided to roll out for other places. But what we saw in the training data, it was like head of the household is mainly defined by male, and thinking about resettlement and integration in another place for the whole family based on employment likelihood, it doesn't feel like a real integration when you think about first of all, it thinks about heterosexual families, mom and dad, and children are also their well-being and integration possibilities in the city as not taken into account. It's solely based on employment likelihood. There is other types of technologies predicting future migration flows through social media activities. In one cases, they use Facebook or currently Meta's advertising platform to realize how many Venezuelans they were in Venezuela, and now they moved to the United States. So to kind of understand the flow of like increase in the activities from Venezuela and inside the country and from outside the country, and from there understanding or GPS data, some realizing, finding out some socioeconomic data to try to predict future migration flows. And when you read about these studies or these tools, they say the reason we want to predict future migration flows is because we want to be prepared to provide services, humanitarian services for the new migration flows. But for us who work in migration technologies, and we have seen in the past that there is a lack of political will, that in fact these technologies, instead of being used for providing better humanitarian services, they're used for pushback, they're used for militarization of borders, putting more technology, putting more forces on border control when there is that kind of prediction of migration flows. And in cases of asylum seekers and migrants, if you're children, you have other types of legal protection. As a result, there is this assumptions that asylum seekers, they lie about their age. As a result, they're using all kinds of age verification tools, X-ray, and now the new ones are mostly DNA-based. And other types of tools, sexual identity verification tools, again, some of the asylum seekers that they leave their home country based on the hostility towards homosexuality. When they tell their stories, officials or authorities, they want to save, they say the truth about their sexual identity. And as a result, they use some verification tools. But researchers, they also have shown there is so much stereotypes around sexual identity and some homosexuality. And it's not one thing. It's different in different countries and different communities. And it's not something that easily can be verified by machine learning enabled tools. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about gender and sexuality dimension in migration control technologies and in the technologies that I described now, that as you saw, most of them, they were created, the tools were created by private sectors, and then they were bought by officials, either government agencies or humanitarian agencies. There have been cases, researchers that have done studies that facial recognition technologies, voice recognition technologies, they show higher error rates for women. The fingerprinting technology that I mentioned for registration, often it's used, and service allocation. The readers, it has difficulties with reading women's prints because the damages of cooking or cleaning injuries And there have been also studies that women in low-income countries are less likely to own a smartphone. So when you tie all these migration services to the use of phone as smartphones, by default, you kind of like exclude the people who have a lower digital literacy and access to these kinds of smartphones. There was a study by Engine Room, is one of the civil society organizations, in 2018 that because of iris scanning, that it's again is tied to biometric data collections for refugees. 70% of the Muslim Rohingya women who were veiled, they refused to take off their veil for doing iris scan, or they felt uncomfortable doing that. And there are all types of, as I mentioned, AI and DNA-based tools to verify sexual orientations that I described it. One other theme that it comes up in migration technology, it's about externalization of borders through technology. And what I mean by that, when the description of this event was saved with me, I noticed that there is something about privatization and about authoritarian and illiberal governments. But when you look at migration technology, there is an irony that in order to enforce borders, they use borderless technology. And you see this collaboration between countries, collaboration in the form of providing technologies, in providing capacity building, in providing trainings by wealthier countries to non-wealthier countries in order to push back the border from their own border to outside, in a way that to do the migration control in the third-party countries and not even dealing with asylum seekers setting foot to their own border, actual territorial border. So there's kinds of like, it was an irony for me that when it comes to putting borders for people's movement, the technology and collaboration between, it becomes borderless, it looks like. And I tried, as I mentioned, I'm from Iran. It's like a textbook authoritarian country. And but when you think about migration technology, it's very hard to draw a line what we mean by illiberal countries, authoritarian countries, because of this borderless types of technologies and collaboration and capacity building between different countries. It happens in European countries. The EU funds biometric screening across North and West Africa. There is this types of like a shared biometric data platforms by 16 African countries that they try to share data with Interpol. There are other types of program, BMP in Maghreb, in Morocco and Tunisia. The US also extended its border southward, funding biometric databases and surveillance infrastructure across Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and other countries in Central America. And what they do, but this by outsourcing of migration management, or what we call it externalization of border, is to push these types of human rights protection that it's guaranteed, or at least on paper, it's guaranteed to asylum seekers based on UN conventions, and put it as a responsibility of third countries with weaker oversight and legal protection for asylum seekers. And why advocacy around migration technology is difficult, and I held my breath because it's one of those things that it becomes very complicated if you work in, especially in private public partnership world. So border externalization, as I mentioned, it creates this jurisdictional gaps, extraterritorial activities that you cannot really pinpoint what country is responsible for what types of technologies. And then it creates this kinds of lack of legal accountability, that it makes the legal protection of asylum seekers very difficult. And migration technologies, as I alluded a little bit in the type of technologies that are used in border, oftentimes it falls under the category of military technologies, national security technology, border control technologies, that they by default, based for many kinds of regulation, it becomes exempt from the type of scrutiny that other types of AI products they receive. And for instance, emotion recognition is banned in workplaces but permitted in migration and asylum processing in the EU AI Act. There is inclusion and exclusion dilemma. You know, as I said, biometric data is used for registering asylum seekers and giving them a status, refugee status. But the same technologies that enable access to services such as food and shelter, then it's used for surveillance and control. So it becomes very hard for advocates to talk about these types of technology because so that, oh, if they are not in the system, they cannot receive food and shelter. And if they are in the system, there might be situations like Rohingyas that the data was shared by the countries that they fled from. And the major technology companies often they frame the type of products that they provide to humanitarian organizations as part of their corporate social responsibility or as gift. For instance, Palantir with World Food Programs, Microsoft with UNHCR, they provide this gift and free and nonprofits kind of like a tier or discount that there is a saying that never look a gift horse in the mouth. So when it's something, it's a gift, you cannot even scrutinize it or say no to it, maybe. And my ask, because Yasmin said that let's talk about resistance against some of this migration technology. And I don't want to end my talk by just mapping some of these technologies and providing discouragement or hopelessness about migration technologies. And there is something that I found very useful in the scrutinizing and looking into public data in order to understand who is involved in what when it comes to procurement practices. As I said, there were companies, Palantir, Cellbrite, Microsoft, BI Incorporate, Clearview, all types of many different companies. And then the way that we can understand how much money they receive, and kind of like seeing a trend about border technologies is through some level of public data that it's available to us. And at least in this time that we feel hopeless about our advocacy, just collecting information, documentation, trying to push for more public data about procurement can be one angle for us researchers, practitioners, and data scientists to try to understand what's happening in procurement practices and private-public partnership when it comes to border and migration technologies. And this comes from one of my collaborators, Ms. Zoe Isaki. She is the founder of Collaborative Research Center for Resilience. And she says, as researchers, probably or practitioners that were not necessarily activists or organizers, our work is connecting the dots. And whenever I feel hopeless about my advocacy, I think about, let me just try as many as dots I can connect it about this issue. And hopefully organizers, advocates, and policymakers that they advocate for the rights of people, they can find our work and this connecting of the dots and push for policy change. And this is kind of like, this is a usspending.gov. It's an open platform by the US government. You can search keywords. Now I search Palantir. You can go to the company. You can see the parent-child companies. Only in 2025, 2026, you can see the trend of the company receiving money and which agencies they received money. For instance, ICE, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security. And there are also description of the award that you can go and search for particular award, although there is very minimal description of the type of awards. So you can get what type of technology is used, but at least you can get some information. And there is this type of product or service code, North American industry classification system that are super outdated. You can never find anything like AI or machine learning as the official category. As you see, everything is very broad: scientific research, computation, IT services. So it's very hard for researchers to look if they want to find out about what types of AI were used. It's very hard to look for a specific code. So that's another thing that we can push governments to update their coding system, because once it's updated, then you can look based on the codes and you say machine learning enabled tools or AI tools, although the definition is very hard to make, but at least it's better than these types of outdated everything under IT or everything under computer services. And this is Cellbrite, as a data extraction company that I mentioned, that you can see in many, many companies that I noticed that in 2025, and now we are in 2000 early, like the first quarter of 2026, but you can see in 2025, there have been major increase, mostly in these types of border technologies. And as I said, you can scrutinize some of the awards, and the departments will receive these types of technology and services. This is another, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's BI Technology, the private or ankle monitor company that I mentioned, and Clearview AI. And this is the work I had done when I was a fellow at UVA. It's a US Responsible AI Procurement Index. And I will share the link with you, the methodology of how to look into the public data, and also the script that I used in order to get some information about the procurement data. Is all available in methodology. And it's not necessarily for migration, but it's for AI. We try to do the keyword AI and machine learning search, and we receive some information for each department, but the methodology is replicable for migration technology if you're interested in doing it. It was in 2023. I'm sure that some kinds of comparative analysis between 2023 with one administration in the US and 2025, 2026 with another administration, it might provide some revealing information. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't go over time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Raya, for your presentation. We already have like many questions on the Q&A, but now we move for Ana Brian's presentation. So we have Ana Brian Nougrères here with us. Ana Brian currently serves as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. Her work focuses on data protection, human rights, and applications of digital technologies for democratic governance as well, including in contexts such as migration and state surveillance. That is the topic of our discussion today. So thank you so much, Ana Brian, for being here with us and for accepting our invitation. So whenever you want to start, the floor is yours. Thank you so much once again. I think you're muted, Anna. If you could just turn the mic on. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jasmine. Good morning to everyone joining us from across the globe. I want to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to Jasmine Kersey and to Jess Raya for their kind invitation to participate in this 8th session of the Gender and Tech Online Talk series. It is a true privilege to share this virtual floor with Roya Paxad, whose work on human rights-centered design is more necessary today than ever. I approach today's discussion through the lens of my mandate as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy, a role I have had the honor of serving since 2021. My perspective is deeply rooted in my legal and academic background at Universidad de la República and Universidad de Montevideo in Uruguay, and to my experience helping shape the privacy laws that eventually made Uruguay the first non-European country to join Convention 108. We are gathered here to dissect a phenomenon that is as complex as it is urgent, the immigration and techno authoritarianism. We must recognize that we are no longer looking at isolated software or simple data collection. We are witnessing the production and expansion of vast surveillance networks. As we will explore over the next minutes, these digital technologies do not exist in a vacuum. They currently impact fundamental rights, enshrine authoritarian practices in the very heart of our public services, and most concerningly, they continue to deepen social inequalities across the world. In a world where algorithms often act as the new border guards, we must ask ourselves, what happens to privacy when security becomes a pretext for techno-authoritarian control? To begin our exploration of the core themes we must address, the central question posed by this series, that is, what are the most pressing issues for gender minorities when artificial intelligence is integrated into immigration systems? The role of digital technologies in the production of surveillance networks is not gender neutral. The deployment of AI in border control often prioritizes technical efficiency over human complexity, relying on algorithms that are frequently trained on rigid binary datasets. For women, and particularly for queer and gender diverse individuals, this creates a landscape of algorithmic exclusion that directly impacts their fundamental rights. When an automated system is designed to recognize only two gender categories, or anyone whose identity, documents, or physical appearance does not conform to those narrow parameters, is immediately flagged as an anomaly or a potential security risk. This techno-authoritarian approach treats the human body as a data point to be decoded, often leading to invasive secondary screening or even to detention. For a person fleeing persecution based on their gender identity, being subjected to technologies that out them to authorities is not just a privacy violation, it is a lifetime-threatening risk. Furthermore, we must recognize that these systems enshrine authoritarian practices in public services. By automating the classification of individuals at the border, the state deepens social inequalities worldwide. We are seeing a dangerous shift, where technologies intended for management are instead used to expand surveillance networks that target the most vulnerable. In my capacity as UN Special Reporter, I must emphasize that the right to privacy is the shield that allows individuals to define their own identities without fear of state-sponsored digital profiling. When we allow AI to automate historical prejudices, we are not just building smart borders. We are building infrastructure that can be used to marginalize and monitor gender minorities on a global scale. Moving now from the who to the how, we must critically examine the structural backbone of these surveillance networks, the intricate nexus between state procurements and private partnerships. In this session, we are specifically asked to discuss how these collaborations facilitate the deployment of immigration surveillance systems. In many jurisdictions, we are witnessing a significant shift where the development, management, and even operational logic of border control are outsourced to private enterprises. That is not merely a technical choice. It is a political and economic one that fundamentally alters the nature of public services and processes. When a government procures a surveillance system, it is often purchasing a black box, a proprietary algorithm whose inner workings are shielded by commercial secrecy. This creates a critical accountability gap, as the UN Special Rapporteur I have observed. When surveillance is privatized, democratic oversight is often sidelined. If an automated decision-making system at a border flags gender-diverse individual as a threat, where is transparency? Because the system is proprietary, civil society and even judicial bodies are frequently denied the right to audit the code for bias or human rights compliance. We are effectively allowing private profit motives to dictate the boundaries of fundamental rights. Furthermore, these partnerships often lead to surveillance creep. Private companies, driven by the need for market expansion, frequently upsell additional surveillance features, biometrics, facial recognition, social media scraping, to governments under the guise of security upgrades. This deepens social inequalities worldwide by creating a permanent high-tech infrastructure of suspicion that targets those who already lack the legal means to defend their privacy. Drawing from my experience in Uruguay, where I participated in the approval of our personal data protection law in 2008, I can tell you that robust legal frameworks are our only defense. Uruguay's commitment to international standards, becoming the first non-European country to sign Convention 108, was a statement that privacy is a new, non-negotiable unit on state and corporate power, both sides. We must demand that procurement processes include mandatory human rights impact assessments that are both public and transparent. A private contract should never be a shield against the universal obligation to respect human dignity, especially for immigrant communities and gender minorities who are most at risk of being harmed by these invisible surveillance networks. This brings us to one of the most provocative and urgent questions of this session. Are enterprises responsible for amplifying human rights violation and enabling anticipatory compliance with authoritarian or illiberal governments? As the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy, I believe we must start by dismantling a long-standing myth, the myth of technological neutrality. Technology is not a passive tool. It is a reflection of the values, biases, and economic incentives of those who created it. When we speak of anticipatory compliance, we are describing a deeply troubling phenomenon where private companies, in the pursuit of market expansion, preemptively design their systems to be authoritarian ready. They do not wait for a formal legal mandate. Instead, they build features such as backdoors for data harvesting or specific biometric filters, simply to lower the friction for adoption by regimes that prioritize control over human rights. In my work, I have seen how this logic directly impacts the most vulnerable. Enterprises often argue they are merely complying with local laws. However, when those laws violate international human rights standards, the company is no longer a neutral provider. It becomes an enabler of state-sponsored surveillance. If a company develops an AI-driven immigration system that flags gender nonconformity to satisfy an illiberal government's requirements, that company is directly responsible for the subsequent persecution of those individuals. Corporate responsibility that must move beyond a simple checklist approach. Under the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, companies have an affirmative duty to conduct rigorous human rights impact assessments before deploying their tools in sensitive environments. Drawing from my experience in the National Parliament of Uruguay and our efforts to establish a robust data protection law, I can tell you that accountability cannot be outsourced. We must move toward a global standard of human rights by design. This means that if a technology, by its very architecture, facilitates the mass surveillance of immigrant communities or the profiling of gender diverse individuals, it is a defective product. We must demand that enterprises stop acting as the silent architectures of techno authoritarianism. It is not enough to have a diverse board of directors if your product is being used to automate the marginalization of minorities across the global south. Privacy is a non-negotiable human right, and the private sector must decide whether it will be a shield for human dignity or a megaphone for authoritarian power. While we have focused on the grave risks of surveillance and techno-authoritarianism, we must also recognize the dual nature of these digital tools. To address the final question of this session, I will say that technology can and technology does play a vital role in building support networks for immigrant communities. For many migrants, particularly gender minorities fleeing violence, digital platforms are a lifetime. Encrypted messaging and decentralized networks allow communities to share information about safe routes, legal aid, and essential services without the immediate threat of state monitoring. However, we must be clear. This positive role of technology is only sustainable if we protect the underlying right to privacy. Without privacy, these support networks become traps for the very people that are meant to protect. Sorry for this. As we conclude, I want to emphasize that our goal must be to move towards an inclusive, rights-focused digital governance framework. This requires us to move away from the one-size-fits-all approach and listen to those most impacted by these surveillance networks. Digital borders must not be black boxes of proprietary code. They must be transparent and subject to public scrutiny. Also, technology should serve the person, not the other way around. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy, I will continue to advocate for international standards that prevent the automation of prejudice. I look forward to the report that will be organized around these serious findings, and I am eager to hear your thoughts during our question and answer session. Thank you once again to Jasmine Kersey and Jasria for organizing this vital space for dialogue. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ana Brienne, for your presentation. We have so many questions here in the Q&A, so I will start with Beatriz Medeiros, who is wondering how countries with such restricted laws on the use of personal data, such as Germany with the Daten, should justify the storage and use of personal data provided by immigrants, especially when we know that AI uses collected data to train, which also involves another ethical issue. What are the reason around it? Doesn't it put a question mark on the whole liberal ideas of these countries? So who wants to come first? I think Ana Brienne, if you want to address this first, and then Roya can add something to it, and then we roll with that. Thank you so much, Ana.
Germany has a data protection system that is fully accordingly to the GDPR. I mean, there are legitimate ways of not complying with what are the general principles. There are like exceptions to the general rule that might be national security or might be security issues of the country. I don't especially know the case of Germany, but I think that they would probably use one of those exceptions to comply with the regulations and with the GDPR.
Roya, do you want to add something to that?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Anna, for your great presentation about how to use human rights framework in human rights impact assessment, due diligence, UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Your work, I just want to appreciate your work because it helps us as practitioners and consultants to be able to do the work.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and to answer the questions, as I mentioned, unfortunately, externalization of borders, it creates this kinds of like jurisdiction ambiguity about how data is collected and shared. The other thing is so many of data protection laws, they exempt military applications, national security and defense. And unfortunately, so many of border technologies are characterized as military technologies that it makes them exempt from that types of scrutiny that it's available on other types of data protections or applications that, you know, other users, non-refugee, non-migrants maybe like use in like a day-to-day life. The other issue is also about informed consent. So when we have data protection law, most of data protection laws are based on informed consent. And what do we mean by informed here? It's something that we don't know, especially in the context of refugees and asylum seekers, because as I mentioned, there's always this inclusion versus exclusion dilemma. If you want to receive food and shelter and you want to have the refugee status, your biometric data should be in the system. If you don't want it, then there are difficulties for receiving these services. As a result, it creates this kinds of informed consent issue that so many of these data protection laws, including GDPR, is based on that. And then you basically don't have that kind of informed consent, and it becomes meaningless, at least for asylum seekers and refugees, to give the consent because the cost of not giving any kinds of consent is so high for them, for including not receiving services.
Thank you so much.
Yes, you're right, Roya. And that's a big problem. Up to what point that consent is a freely given consent? Is it a freely given consent? And that takes us to the foundations of all the data protection systems. That is our problem. We need to keep on working at it. Thank you.
Following for the next question, there is one from Jess Rhea, who posted here for me in private on immigration enforcement increasingly relies on private vendors for biometric systems, data analytics, and AI-driven surveillance tools. What reforms to procurement process, such as human rights impact assessments, community consultation requirements, open auditing, or public interest procurement models do you see as essential to prevent rights eroding technologies from being normalized through government contracting? So who wants to go first? Anna, and then Raya again.
As you wish, as you wish. I think it's a very interesting question. And we would have 3 seminars on that, not just a conversation. I think that all measures should be taken into consideration, and much more measures. And when time passes and we have new possibilities of bringing safety to all the people that are in the state of migrations, because we should apply them also. To apply everything is not enough. We have to get to the point in which both parts, let's say the state and the migrants, agree in that there's the need of safety measures, but both agree which measures are safe.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to add just thanks for your question, just bringing up one example of what happened in Santa Cruz, California, where I'm currently living. So the flock technology is another types of license plate readers that the company, they started rolling their technology in many cities in the United States for license plate readers. It became clear that the company, there is some types of like a data sharing with ICE for immigration enforcement. So many community members, advocates, organizers, they started pushing their cities, going to city council meetings and saying, we don't want flock. We don't want you to extend flock contract. And I want to give you a successful example in Santa Cruz. They started Get the Flock Out campaign in Santa Cruz, and Santa Cruz, our city, they didn't extend a contract. So that's something that it's one of the hopeful thing of the power of community organizing, for the cities. I know that sometimes when I feel hopeless about federal governments and the United States or how to push against these types of border technologies, I can find some of the examples in the smaller cities, including the city that I live in, that these types of organizing, going to city council, raising your voices, it's helpful. Otherwise, finding procurement contracts, it's very, very difficult. I tried to do that when I was a fellow at UVA. I submitted a lot of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, to get the contracts, to read the contracts, to see if, as Anna mentioned, if I can bring some kinds of human rights impact assessment element to these types of contracts. But they are all classified, or they don't respond to you. You have to follow up a lot. I didn't get any kinds of, based on my FOIA request, I didn't get anything. I know that there are so many people that they're more persistent about getting some of the contracts, but at least I couldn't. But I can see the power of community organizing and advocacy, and flock cameras was one of the example I mentioned.
Thank you so much, Raya. Here in Brazil, the situation is a bit similar to that. Like, we have the Freedom of Information Act as well here in Brazil. The LAI is basically the same institute. But often the government, they deny the requests, or they don't answer it properly. They deny information, they hide information, especially regarding facial recognition technologies that are expanding in every city here in Brazil right now, with really blurred purposes. And it's really difficult to address all of that. But following forward to the next question, we have one specific to Roya from Nora Opperman. Roya Pakzat, can you give an example of a sexual identity verification tool? And can you explain how they hope to verify a sexual identity? This sounds so horrible and only pseudo-scientific. Thank you for a rich presentation. Just to add to that, if I can, just a bit, there is a report also, Nora, if you want to know more about this topic by Jess Rea on trans digital rights. It is available at UVA's website as well. But Raya, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Nora, and thank you. LJ also asked us similar questions. So one of the technology, it came out, the study, so many of them, they're pilot research, and it came out again from Stanford University that they tried to scrape all kinds of data from one data set that I can't recall now, but basically, as you, Nora, mentioned yourself, it's pseudoscience and some stereotypes about makeups, about facial appearance, about wearing appliances that kind of tells you that, okay, this person might be gay or other sexual identity they might have. So completely pseudoscience kind of a type of technology, assumption. The other one, again, South African University, two years later, that the Stanford study, they really got pushed back. So many people, they said that it's a pseudoscience, as you were saying. And then again, 2019, another study came out. They said, okay, now they just said of 3 dating websites, and now from the dating websites and from facial images and the, again, appearances, makeup, we might know that it's what is the sexual orientation. So that is one of the type of technology that it's kind of under research mostly. I don't know, I haven't found evidence of being used for asylum adjudication. The way that's just I'm just referring the experimentation part by universities, but the other types of sexual orientation verification is through social media activities. And that is something that they try to see, what are the pages you follow, what are the comments you make, who are your friends, and from that they realize, oh, actually, if you're saying that you're gay, lesbian, if you are or you are not. So that is another kinds of a social media surveillance, in addition to what you mentioned, exactly, pseudoscience assumptions about homosexuality.
So there is a question from me, actually, for both of us. So in recent reports, agencies like the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the ICE, have expanded their presence and operations in and around the U.S. airports, raising concerns about increased surveillance and control of migrants and even citizens. How should we understand the role of airports as sites of intensified techno-authoritarian control, particularly with the integration of biometric systems, data sharing, and AI-driven risk profiling? So what legal or advocacy strategies are already existing, both in the US context that you are aware, to challenge or limit these practices, especially when they blur the line between border enforcement and everyday mobility for people? So who wants to go first? Let me
there are 3 basic principles that basically should be applied in cases that the regulations are not in a similar level of standards. And those principles are 3. One is legality. That means that you must ask according to what is legal regulations of the place where you are. The second one is necessity. I mean, there should be a need to take a decision in one sense or other. And the third one is proportionality. I mean, there should be a balance made between the human rights and the application of the regulations, and then a decision made through it. And we always must have remedies in case this does not provide a fair solution. I think that's what I would do in the case of difficulties. Of course, we have artificial intelligence with the bias and all that. That's another story. That's another story.
Yeah, and Yasmin, thanks for your question. So another types of AI that it's used in Europe as lie detector, and it's used in the airports, as you mentioned. And in the United States, there is, I think the company's name is Clear, or I might miss the name, but it's basically on facial recognition technologies, and then it's supposed to make it easier for you to go through this border, like not border control, but just like just like passing the check-in process. And in fact, when I was at UVA, I think a month ago, and when I was going back to San Francisco airport, I saw that there was a sign, and it was a big sign. It was something that you could see for every person who was checking your identity, ID, that it says that we use facial recognition technology. If you don't want to take a photo, tell us. So it looks to me that it's just like, and I said that, and they checked some of it, like, they checked my passport and identity in other way. And so that the fact that there is that like large sign, like right next to the officer who is going to check your ID or your passport and let you in, that by itself, I think it's effective. In the context of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, because again, we're saying that the way that's just like practicing their rights, it becomes scarier. There's not that much protection of like asylum seeker has versus me, who was a US citizen. I had a US passport. So it was kind of like there's a power difference here to exercise our rights and request for not being on this facial recognition technology. But in terms of like a legal practices, our legal rights, I don't know. It's not, I have to look into that. But in terms of like advocacy or something that airports they can do as just that simple sign, it helps me to kind of like say or raise my voice, say something. So that can be one of the way to do that, maybe. But as you know, once you are, again, you have to stay. If you try to use a facial recognition, you get to your gate faster and quicker. But if you don't want, you have to go through, you're going to add additional
Huge lines,
15, 20 minutes, So you have to choose a between. And then when you're late, then you say, okay, I don't want to practice my rights. Just let me go.
I've seen also at the airports a letter saying that all the information that is caught under the informatic systems when you cross through frontier is going to be in the system for, let's say, I don't know, 5 minutes or during the process of crossing the frontier, no more. That's an important security measure. Of course, you have to see if they really comply with it or not. But I've seen it like in a big place where you can see it and read it. And that you always have the option to go to manual control. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Anna and Raya. We unfortunately have to close the session right now. I'll pass it up to Jazz so they can make the closing remarks. Thank you so much once again for all of you that are here with us today and joined us throughout the series. Jazz, please go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Roya, Ana Bria, and Yasmin for this important conversation. And I just want to recommend everyone look into the gender self-determination debate and paying attention to how limited views on gender identity can cause harm to trans people as well, in immigration, detention centers, and beyond. I shared the report there if you're interested. And as mentioned before, we will end the Gender and Tech Talk series by the end of April with our last session, possible AI futures. You receive like the specific details by email and social media. And please subscribe to the DTG Lab newsletter to stay updated and access the recordings if you are interested. And thanks again to the overwhelmingly positive support we have been receiving. It means the world to us. So thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye.